The cooking method we'll be looking at here is casseroling, and we're going to make an easy beef and red wine stew. We're going to be using stewing steak for this recipe. You could equally use pork or lamb, but ask your butcher which cut to use. Here we have 1 pound or 450 grams of stewing beef. We also have 200 grams of lardons. You can ask your butcher to cut you some cubes of streaky bacon for that. We then have 110 grams or 4 ounces of button onions, and we have the same amount of button mushrooms. We have 1 medium onion, which is sliced, and 2 cloves of garlic, which are also sliced. We are going to use some herbs in the recipe. We're using bay leaves, and we've got 6 sprigs of thyme, which have been stripped of their leaves. To that recipe, we're also going to add 2 heaped tablespoons of plain flour and 425 mils or 15 fluid ounces of red wine. So now we're going to look at the method. First of all, in a pan, we're going to saute the button onions and the button mushrooms. We've left them whole so they don't fall apart during the cooking time. Where possible, use a heavy-based frying pan so you can turn up the heat and it distributes the heat evenly through the pan. I'm going to use a couple of tablespoons of olive oil. You can use any other oil here. You can use sunflower oil or nut oil. They have higher flash points, but olive oil should be fine for this one. While that pan's heating, I'm going to bring in this bowl where we're going to mix the meat and all the other ingredients. What we're going to do is we're going to coat it with flour, and the flour will act in the sauce. It will thicken it as the meat cooks in the oven, but also it will bind to the fat so you don't get a fatty residue on the top of your casserole. While we're also doing this, it's important to preheat the oven before you put in your casserole to 140 degrees Celsius, gas mark 1. If you have a fan-assisted oven, you might want to reduce that to about 120 degrees Celsius. Now that the pan's warming up, we'll add in the onions and the mushrooms. I'm just going to leave that to do its own thing there at the moment. In this bowl here, we'll add 450 grams of stewing beef. To that, we're going to add the medium onion, which has been sliced, the garlic, the thyme, the bay leaves, and the lardons or the streaky bacon. So in here, we will also add the 2 heaped tablespoons of plain flour and use our hands to mix it. Make sure that you evenly coat the flour over all the meat. So it should end up something like this. Here, we just stir our onions and the mushrooms, and you can see that they're beginning to colour and caramelise. It's important to do this to release the natural sugars, and also it will give the stew a bit of colour. It's also important to wash your hands thoroughly in between handling raw meat. So these are nearly done, just some of them need a little bit more colour. But while that's happening, I'll bring in the casserole dish that we're going to use. Now, if you don't have one of these casserole dishes, you can actually just use a roasting tin and cover it with tin foil. It's not quite as good because the seal isn't as tight, but it will suffice. They're browning off nicely in the pan there. So into the casserole, we're going to place all the meat and all the vegetables without losing any of it. And then once the mushrooms and onions are sautéed, We can turn the heat off and allow that just to cool just for a couple of minutes. Into the casserole we'll add the 425 ml of red wine, and for this you can use any red wine, as long as it's quite full-bodied and full of flavour. If you wanted an alternative, you could also use a heavy ale or Guinness, and that would do the same job. I shall just stir this a little bit. And it doesn't look like a very promising dish when we start off, but my advice is to cover it, leave it in the oven for 3 hours at 140 degrees Celsius, and when you take it out, it will be transformed. These are still sizzling away here, but we shall add the onions and the button mushrooms, which have taken on the colour in the pan, into the casserole. And again, just stir it all together without trying to splash it everywhere. And like I say, unpromising to start off with, but cover it, put it in the oven for 3 hours, and forget about it during that time. So that's our easy beef in red wine had 3 hours. Let's have a look in the oven and see how it's turned out. This is a dish you can make in advance, or you can double the quantities and make it in batches and store it in the fridge for the next day or in the freezer for up to 3 months. Here we go. A completely different sight to the one we put into the oven earlier. You can see that the sauce is reduced right down and has really thickened up. And now we're going to serve it with some fluffy mashed potatoes and some vegetables which I prepared earlier. This recipe should serve 4 easily. And just remember to take the bay leaves out before you serve them. There we go. That's 1 portion of easy beef and red wine.